I'm Tony Janaitis. I'm director of the Frederick S. Pardee Center for the Study of the Longer Range Future. I want to say just a few words about the Pardee Center and then introduce our speaker. Through the incredible generosity of Mr. Pardee, we're really privileged here at BU at the center to be able to reach across the entire faculty, across disciplines, across the nation and internationally to convene, to try to catalyze research and to engage decision-making communities and really help create a new generation of scholars. We're focused on challenges of understanding how the future unfolds and those factors that affect it, whether they're economic, political, cultural, institutional, or scientific, and how our scholarship and research really might be put to use to improve the human condition. And one of the really fun aspects of my job is getting to select the annual distinguished lecturer. And it's a tremendous challenge. I sat down to start thinking about this really last summer. And so I started putting together a list of criteria. Who's the kind of person and the kind of topics that would really reach across disciplines, who could draw on a depth and breadth of practical experience that would make such a presentation especially interesting to our community. And as you might imagine, the list of such people is short. But Rosina was at the top. And so I'd like to introduce Rosina Beerbaum, who will be this year's Pardee Distinguished Lecturer. Rosina has a degree in ecology and evolutionary biology. Let's just say a number of years ago, she decided to spend a year on a congressional fellowship in Washington, with every intent of returning to academia and working on host-parasite relationships and marine ecosystems, and live in Woods Hole the rest of her life, which she shared with us this morning at the luncheon lecture that she gave. Instead, she spent the next 18 years in Washington, 10 years at the Office of Technology Assessment, 8 years in the executive branch, in several White Houses and several administrations, where she held posts as the Associate Director for the Environment in OSTP and spent several months as the Acting Director of the Office of Science and Technology. Upon leaving the White House, she finally then returned to academia and spent another decade as the Dean in the Interdisciplinary School of Natural Resources and Environment at the University of Michigan, where she's had a long and distinguished career with a tremendous amount of impact, having tripled the amount of interdisciplinary research, created new graduate programs, created a host of interdisciplinary programs in an institution that was strong when she got there and stronger when she left. Rosina is the scientific advisor to basically everyone who matters. She chairs the Science and Technical Advisory Panel for the Global Environment Facility. She is a member of PCAS, the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. And she has participated in all 3 of the U.S. National Climate Assessments and probably in all of the IPCC assessments. But what we've asked Rosina to focus on is not just a challenge of climate science, but it's really to reflect on one of her other experiences during a sabbatical year at the World Bank, where she headed the preparation of the World Development Report, and to focus on a particular challenge in this domain, which is the collision of goals for development in the developing countries in the world and the kinds of changes that we're seeing in the physical environment as a consequences of changes in the climate system. And so we've asked Rosina to talk about that. Her talk is titled "Past is Not Prologue: How Climate Change Alters Development Prospects." And with that, let me yield the podium When Rosina finishes, we'll have I'm going to come back up and moderate a Q&A session, and then we will adjourn promptly at 6:30 for a reception, which I hope everybody will stay for. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tony. Well, thank you, everyone. I hope I can live up to that introduction. So you've seen the title slide. There are lots of new reports that have come out in the last year. And what do we know based on them? Here are some of the conclusions of the new IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports, the draft of our National Climate Assessment, which is what NCA stands for. But this also reflects what the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the National Research Council, some new World Bank reports, and the Global Environment Facility have included. And none of this is really good news. Warming is continuing. We have carbon dioxide, the main greenhouse gas, at record levels. Sea level rise is accelerating. And already today, at about a 0.8 degrees Celsius temperature increase, we are seeing impacts on food production, on ecosystems, on human health, on water, and on some extreme events. Business as usual, which is really not an option, could lead the world to a 4 degrees Celsius world above pre-industrial levels by the end of this century. And those impacts will lead to literally unprecedented high temperatures in some parts of the world and real loss of livelihoods. But the impacts at a 2-degree world, which is what most of the world has agreed to in the international treaty negotiations and most of the science communities of the world have called for, is no picnic either. And those impacts will definitely negatively affect the poorest on the globe, whether they're in developing countries or our own countries. And so there are cost-effective options to get back onto this 2-degree world, but the window is closing very quickly. So here are the brand new covers of the IPCC report, the Physical Science Report 2013. A headline from that report is, "It is extremely likely," which is a 95% probability confidence level, something you never really see from scientists, that more than half of the warming observed since 1950 was caused by anthropogenic emissions. Working Group 3 on the right, which is mitigation, was just released. Some headlines from that are that emissions grew more rapidly between 2000 and 2010 than in each of the previous 3 decades, that the United States and China now equal 43% of the global emissions, and that to mitigate or to keep temperatures near that 2-degree magic number above pre-industrial levels could decrease global growth rates by 0.06% a year. So instead of maybe growing at 2% a year, we might grow at 1.96% a year. And you can immediately see how there are ways to make that number look really small or look really big in aggregate. This is Working Group 2, which is on impacts and vulnerability, also has just come out, and these are showing people planting mangroves in Tuvalu to try to help with storm surges that are increasing as sea level rises. Lots of interesting new detail in this report that species are on the move, and that as the temperatures warm, they're moving towards the poles to keep to cooler climates. And we had good evidence in the previous IPCC report that terrestrial species were moving perhaps on the order of about 4 miles a decade towards the poles. But in this report, they're now talking about what's happening in the marine world. And they have estimates that marine species, 350 marine species, are moving on average 250 miles per decade. So ecosystems are literally being disrupted as the parts that swim and fly and are wind dispersed are moving and getting out of sync with each other. So basically, we have a choice. We have a tale of 2 futures. The future's in our hands. We can leave the next generation, the world's on the left, the 2-degree world, or the next generation, the world on the right, the 4-degree world. And you can see that that 4-degree average temperature increase on the right is more than double that at the poles, with vastly drier areas shown in brown and vastly wetter areas shown in blue. And I would argue that that roasted world on the right is a virtually unrecognizable planet, but we can still choose the world that we want to leave to the next generation. There are some interesting additional nuances that are coming out of these new reports. What I think is really interesting is that whether it's the IPCC report or the National Climate Assessment, that making adaptation to climate change now co-equal with mitigation to climate change has been recognized. There's actually 4 chapters on adaptation in the IPCC impacts report. And of course, there's an adaptation chapter in the US National Climate Assessment that I led. And this theme that we have to learn to cope even while we continue to mitigate as rapidly as possible is very much front and center. For a long time, I think the word adaptation was overlooked, ignored, almost the scarlet A letter. A lot more emphasis on how other stresses of all types, environmental, of course, if you're talking about species loss or habitat degradation or pollution, but also socioeconomic and political, can exacerbate the impacts of climate change. And then as you try to tease these apart and figure out ways forward, there's a lot of devils in the details. And so both the new IPCC and the National Climate Assessment Report have these interesting kind of cross-cutting chapters, trying to think about how can you think about land and water and energy simultaneously. You can't optimize everything, but you know their interactions. Increasing recognition that growth must continue, but you have to decouple the improvement in livelihoods from the increased degradation in the environment. And very importantly, there's got to be some leadership. And the public sector absolutely has to lead, but they can't do it alone. And that the task, the financial task, is enormous. And the effort right now is incommensurate with the task. And we really need kind of transformational change. So real theme of urgency and interconnectivity. And so sustainable development is really not possible without confronting climate change. And I think it's interesting that the science community has gotten to this point in recent years. But I would actually argue that the evidence for this has been mounting in different arenas, not so much in the climate change world. For many years, the development community has been expressing concerns that business as usual, development gains were being lost as climate shocks were increasing, and that the world was already an unsustainable place. And so if you think about today, there's been some improvement, but we've still got more than 1 billion people living in poverty without electricity, without clean water, a lot of undernourishment and illiteracy. And so what will this world tomorrow look like? Well, 2 of the reports that Tony mentioned, which were begun a decade ago, one for the UN on the left and one for the World Bank on the right, already began to point out that virtually every sector will be challenged by climate change in every part of the globe, and that we are ill-equipped to cope with climate change now, and both adaptation and mitigation would be needed. And I think the subtitle of the UN report is particularly interesting. It was developed by John Schellenhuber, the German on our panel, and he said we need to avoid the unmanageable and manage the unavoidable. So avoid the unmanageable by mitigating as much as you can, manage the unavoidable by adapting as much as you can. And so I would argue that the development community started to build this into their psyche almost a decade ago. And if you've watched the new, reasonably new president of the World Bank, Jim Kim, he has actually proclaimed that the mission of the bank, which is to alleviate poverty, cannot be achieved without confronting climate change. As he said, it goes to the very core of the development work. It was very interesting in 2011 and 2012, he commissioned 2 additional reports, Turn Down the Heat, Why a 4-degree Celsius World Must Be Avoided, and then Turn Down the Heat 2, we're actually doing a Turn Down the Heat 3. The one on the right began to look at regions of the world, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa, and Turn Down the Heat 3 will look at the other 3 regions the World Bank looks at. And they began to explore how climate change and development would interact. And I remember when the first report came out, I was asked to comment on it at the American Geophysical Union, and so I gave, what it said. And it's one of the biggest science meetings annually, and 19,000 scientists attend. There were not that many at my talk. But anyway, when I finished the talk, they said, we knew that. What's new here? what was new in the science that was presented. And it really struck me, but I said, I think sometimes there may not be new messages, but having a new messenger is really important. And in the case of the World Bank, this first report got 20 million internet hits. And so I said, none of us have ever published a paper, and probably the IPCC has never gotten 20 million hits. So anyway, I think we might actually have reached a point now where the science community and the development community are united in their thinking that climate change is inextricably linked. And I think that the business community and parts of the public sector are also coming along too. And so I'll show some signs of that later in my talk. I think you know some of the basic statistics. This chart is from our soon-to-be-released National Climate Assessment. Next week is the release date, but this is from the officially approved public draft that came out for comment a few months ago. You've seen that temperatures have been increasing. That's the left axis and the bars, as CO2, the black line, has been increasing. CO2 was probably 275 parts per million at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and it's now 400. So the air has 40% more CO2 in it than it did than 100 years ago. And of course, there's bumps and wiggles in the temperature record from El Niños and sunspots and volcanoes, but there's a clear increase, and you can see that sentence from the IPCC, most of the warming in the last 50 years, looks pretty tight to that CO2 temperature increase. You also know that we can measure temperatures from the ice in air bubbles in ice cores in the Antarctica. This just goes back 450 years. We can go back about 1 million years. But I think on this scale, you can see that as the Earth went in and out of ice ages, the CO2 went from about 180 to 280. You can see where it is now, or where it was a year ago now. Very, very high, and headed to something that's easily 600 parts per million, to that roasted world, unless the world agrees to much more action than we have to date. And this is all happening, that incredible increase, in a geologic blink of an eye, not millennia. So we're really pushing human systems and ecological systems faster than really in the history of humankind. Let's look at some of the new IPCC data. Boy, they've got lots of information on these new maps. But basically, if an icon is solid and next to it there are a lot of solid bars, that means they're pretty confident. So if you're looking at this, we're seeing for the US, we're confident that there's changes in snow and ice and terrestrial ecosystems. And look at the Arctic. You've got all solid icons there, whether they're talking about water, coast, terrestrial ecosystems, marine ecosystems, and livelihood. That means changes have been observed already. If you move down to South America, you see a solid tractor. That means that food production is being affected. But you also see solid people. That means that livelihoods are being affected. And what really struck me when I moved over here is how many solid fish there are. And so you see the marine ecosystems that I was talking about shifting perhaps at the rate of up to 250 miles per decade are really moving. So lots of interesting new data on observed shifts, and lots of new application of kind of certainty levels to those shifts that we're seeing. We know a lot's happening in the cryosphere. We know we're observing a very rapid melt of the Greenland ice sheet. And the orange are the melting areas in 92 and 2002, 2007. This is something that our physics models didn't predict, and so this is something where uncertainty cuts in the wrong way as in exacerbating climate change. But Greenland's contribution to sea level rises is now considerable, and we have seen sea level rise increase from about 1.7 millimeters per year to about 3.2 millimeters per year in the last decade, and some of that is now being attributed to Greenland. And in fact, in July of 2012, the entire surface of Greenland was melting. The whole map was orange, something that hadn't been observed before. And I think you know, if Greenland were to melt, that's 7 meters or 21 feet of sea level rise. And you've also heard a lot in recent years about the Arctic floating sea ice melting at a prodigious rate. Of course, if this doesn't contribute to sea level rise because it's floating, but we may have an ice-free Arctic very soon in the summer, and that creates all kinds of interesting national security and trade issues as the Northwest Passage becomes routinely passable, and also as the Northeast Passage. And of course, that loss of ice creates dark water, which then absorbs more heat and amplifies the warming. But you see on the right the summer ice extent and how it's been plummeting, and on the left, the complete areas in color were the ice cover in 1980. By 1998, it had lost the red part. By 2012, it had lost the areas of pink and red. Both the Northeast and the Northwest passages were traversed last year, interestingly, with cargo of fossil fuel. So interesting that. But we're also seeing, and this is now again from the National Climate Assessment, more rain is coming in more tropical-like extreme rainfall events. And so here you see in New England, the volume of rainfall in these very, very heavy precipitation events has increased 74% in the last 50 years. So these are not Shakespeare's gentle rains from heaven, but rather very erosive ones, which are making spring planting much more difficult and making scenes like this Midwestern scene much more common. But as you know, the warmer weather also is increasing evaporation, and particularly in the interior continents. This is Nebraska in 2012, when 60% of the country was in drought. And as you know, California is in quite a drought right now. Here's a picture of Lake Mead from this year in January, and you can see the bathtub rings showing where the water used to be. Now it's at 1,100 feet. If it drops to 1,000 feet, apparently millions of people would lose their principal source of water. So the increasing droughts and floods that we're seeing are causing impacts. The hottest hots are also increasing. 2012 was the hottest year on record for the United States. Some parts in the Midwest in 2012 had annual temperatures that were between 4 and 6 degrees Fahrenheit above average. That's colossal, not breaking it by tenths of a degree, but by huge amounts. And we were in incredible drought, as I said, 60% of the country. So in this chart, almost 5,000 records were broken. And so people are beginning to attribute some of the extreme heat events to climate change because they are not explainable otherwise. And if you looked at summer temperatures historically, there would be a normal distribution and an even number of events that are average, below average, above average, shown by the red, white, and blue areas. But by the 1980 to 1990, the distribution had shifted, by the next decade even more, and in the last decade even further. So routinely, so the extremely warm summers, which used to cover 0.1% of the northern hemisphere, are now covering 10%. And as you can see, 5 sigma, or 5 standard deviations above average, which are very, very rare and perhaps unprecedented events, are becoming more common. And so new statistical analyses are confirming in many parts of the world that we're seeing very extreme events that cannot be explained without climate change. This is a very complicated graphic, I want to warn you, but it was the only one I could find on supply chain issues. And I wanted to show you, this is from Lloyd's, and it's showing the cascading effects that extreme events in one country can have. So this is Thailand, and as the production networks and supply chains become more globalized, a localized incident can have a really big impact on every level of the business. So the floods in Thailand cost the country $45 billion. More than 600,000 people were unemployed. It closed 10,000 factories. But it really reverberated around the globe. 100,000 cars weren't built. The car parts were in short supply in Detroit. We couldn't find them. And Thailand makes 45% of the hard disks of the world, so those prices increased. And in response to this, we're now seeing that 80% of the suppliers for key electronics manufacturers are being dual sourced to try to hedge against extreme events and make the supply chains more adaptive or resilient, if you will. And if you think of how dependent global supply chains are on water, on reliable crops, on transportation, climate change is changing this baseline in significant ways. In the work that I did for the U.S. National Climate Assessment, we found that U.S. companies are very concerned with how climate change will affect their business, their feedstocks, their water supply and quality, their infrastructure, their core operation, and that whole sequence of supply chains. Some companies are seeing this as an opportunity to explore new market positions or new products or even expanding their operations due to changes in climate, but it's causing a change. What does the future portend? These are all things that we've seen today that I've shown you so far. Well, the business as usual will take us well past that 2-degree guardrail, the blue band, towards that roaster world, the 4-degree band, which is more than 7 degrees Fahrenheit. And this diagram on the right is from the new IPCC Working Group 2 report. And they have in colors ranging from yellow to orange to red to now purple, a new color they had to add for very, very, very high risk. What different impacts would be observed at what different temperatures? And so you see, this is the temperature today. And for unique and threatened ecosystems, we're already having some moderate threat. But you see that by the time we get to 2 degrees relative to current, or let's see, this would be 2 degrees above pre-industrial, we're rapidly getting into the purple area. And one thing I would suggest to you, if you're interested, is you can look up IPCC and Colbert, and he actually did a little video on this, which is both really instructive as well as scary and humorous. So the Intergovernmental Panel has been producing these, as they call them, burning ember charts for each of their reports. But this is the first time that they had to make the danger level as high as it has. So I know the temperature, the European heat wave, this is from 2003. So you see where, oops, I guess I can't make this do it. You see where the blue arrow is. That was the temperature in 2003. And that temperature and that heat wave killed 35,000 people in a rich part of the country. But I want you to see that as you go forward, by 2040, that temperature in 2003 will certainly be normal. And as you go to the 2060s, that temperature will be cool for that. So that's the kind of temperature increases we're expecting. I already mentioned that we have a lot of information on marine shifts, and here is actually one of the figures from the new IPCC report. So the continents are gray, but where you see the yellow to red areas, those are areas where the ocean will see big decreases in productivity, perhaps up to 50% for the darkest reds. Similarly, if you look at what the future might portend for agriculture, where green is an increase in productivity and red is a decrease, this is a composite of 12 different crops. And you see, for most of the poor parts of the world, there are decreases. Again, the darkest red would be about a 50% loss. So this is a composite of wheat, rice, maize, millets, beet, sweet potato, soybean, and 3 of the oil crops. And this is by 2050 that we might see these kind of losses. So this is one of the places where you really see the disparity in the rich and the poor. And I would note that the IPCC report that just came out is saying among the impacts we've already seen, that we've already seen some decreases in wheat and maize, which are 2 of the world's most important grains. This chart is actually a projection for Latin America and the Caribbean. So each pair of lines is a different country. But as you can see, for maize, climate change, or corn, climate change for every country is likely to lead to a decrease in Latin America, regardless of which emission scenario or which climate model you use. And it is believed that this is mainly due to the shorter grain filling period not being compensated for by CO2 fertilization. So maybe some new strategies like new varieties of crops or irrigation or land management could help with adaptation, but it looks like it'll be difficult to completely offset this. And of course, this is a time when we're talking about the population growing, and we actually need to increase productivity, not decrease productivity. And I put this next map in for some of my friends because it shows on the left the coffee producing area in Colombia today, and that's the dark red area, and how little of it will be available for producing coffee in 2050. So about 80% of those will disappear by 2050. In the future, we also are expecting more environmental refugees, principally from sea level rise and storm surge. And this is kind of a messy map, but the blue dots on it are cities of 1 million people or more. So those are big coastal cities for the most part. The red and yellow coastal areas are very fragile areas, so where a rising sea of 3 feet or a meter, which is now quite likely by the end of the century, will put a whole lot of people and a whole lot of infrastructure at risk. And if you look at just one country like Bangladesh, the sea level rise of 1 meter will inundate 17 million people and 16% of the land area. And so this has led, again, to some new aggregation of information that the changing availability of natural resources, freshwater, food, spread of disease vectors, and environmental refugees could, in composite, as climate change lead to conflict. And there's several national entities in the US that have looked at this, and this concern is also now quite prominent if you look at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So what are some ways forward to tackle climate change? Well, we have to move very rapidly, and this is one of the mantras that the World Bank is using now. We have to act now, we have to act together, and we have to act differently. And these are all equally important, and let me just show you some examples of each of these. So acting now is essential, or we're going to foreclose options to us, and we'll go through temperatures that we won't be able to return to. So our ability to keep the warming near the non-roasted world, the 2-degree world, requires really significant action across all sectors and across all countries. And so we need a huge energy revolution, and this chart is only taking you out to 2050. But what it's showing is we want to get off that business as usual top line and beyond that 2-degree trajectory. The key elements of those wedges to take us down. First, the huge red wedge is renewable energy. Orange is significant investments in the next generation of renewables, solar, wind, and sustainably harvested biofuels. You still will need a wedge, the yellow wedge, from nuclear, and that's bigger or smaller in different models. You need that huge blue wedge, carbon capture sequestration, something which has not yet really been built to scale, but we're counting on that so that we can still burn fossil fuels and take the CO2 out. The dark green wedge is how we manage principally our forest and landscapes, but we're also going to have to think about how we design our cities and the energy in them and how we dispose of our waste. But look at that light green wedge, which is the non-greenhouse gases, some of which are very short-lived. And this is another new area that is getting a lot of attention. So the main short-lived climate pollutants are black carbon and methane. And if you reduce those, you can actually have a very big impact on human health and avoid something like 3 million premature deaths from both indoor and outdoor pollution from the black carbon in particular by 2030. But what's really interesting is if you take that gouge, if you will, out of radiative forcing, instead of the business as usual case, what you can do with CO2 is the red line, and what you could do with CO2, methane, and black carbon is the green line. And so between now and 2050, there are a significant number of modelers who think you could actually damp the temperature increase by about 0.5 degrees. And so going after CO2 remains absolutely important, but the ability to go after some of these short-lived gases may actually enable slowing the rate of growth, which allows ecosystems and human systems time to adapt. We are seeing the number and cost of extreme weather events increasing, which gives us another reason, of course, to act now. This is data from Munich Re, and so whether you're looking at the number of weather-related disasters on the left or the dollars of weather-related disasters on the right, they're about 75%. And so we're not doing a great job in protecting people, infrastructure, or ecosystems right now. And we should greatly improve that while we're preparing for these to be increasing in the years ahead. There are actually some very interesting studies that say every dollar spent on improving resilience to disasters is worth about $4 in return. Those are at $4 in disaster relief. I mean, those are tricky studies to do, but quite a bit of evidence that prevention is better than reacting. Of course, not every extreme event can be linked to climate change, but climate change is really loading the dice, if you will, and making extreme events more common. And this is one of my favorite cartoonists from the Washington Post, Tommy Tulls, and here the witness is labeled climate change and is telling the judge, maybe that storm was one of mine and maybe it wasn't. You can't prove a thing, so you'll just have to let me go. And the little guy at the bottom is saying, a loophole you could lose a planet through. So recommend many of his environmental cartoons for you. So acting together must include knowledge transfer, tech transfer, financial capacity building, and international and domestic policy. And so with knowledge and technology, developing countries could have a unique opportunity to, as people say, leapfrog the most inefficient and polluting methods of development and instead have more sustainable technologies. But as the climate change impacts are becoming more disruptive, it's very clear that we need major financial investments from both the public and the private sector, and financing that is going to enable countries to work together for climate mitigation and adaptation. So we need to act together. We also need to act very differently. On the top left, we need to build infrastructure to withstand the new extremes, the new 100-year flood, the new 500-year flood. We have to increase agricultural productivity and the efficiency of water use to feed 3 billion, perhaps, more people. But on the top right, we really have to manage natural capital so that we protect ecosystem goods and services. And this is the Los Plateau of China, which is actually an area about the size of France. And centuries of overuse, overgrazing, and insufficient investments resulted in that brown landscape you saw, but they have restored it. And it was possible, it was costly, it took a lot of time and effort, but the rehabilitation of that region has led to better household incomes, reduced frequency of floods and landslides, and actually environmental conditions that are not just improved locally, but almost thousands of miles away. So we know what we need to do to combat climate change. We have to act now, act together, and act differently. But linking climate change to sustainable development, some of that will happen naturally, but some of it won't. And we have to also look at economic growth without environmental degradation. We still need economic growth. We need improved quality of life for all. We need equity, prosperity, health, education, and of course, adequate food, fiber, and shelter. So in order to, I think that was going to turn red on you. There we go. So in order to do that, we really need to balance the three components of sustainable development, which you see here around the edge of the globe. The financial conditions, and by that I mean everything from employment to income to wealth to markets to trade. The social conditions, which is law and order, security, governance, liberty, justice, equity, education, and environmental conditions, as we've been talking about, air, water, soil, mineral resources, nutrient cycles, the biota. And I think arguments that try to focus on one of these three as paramount are really pointless. They're indispensable. They all interact. The financial system can't function without inputs from the environmental system or without social stability. And we know that social stability can't be maintained even in the most economically prosperous country in the world in the face of environmental disaster, as the US saw in the case of Katrina. So sustainable development should mean improving the human condition in all three of these elements, the economic, the social, and the environmental element, indefinitely or sustainably for future generations. So how can we actually move towards this? I think there's one new set of buzzwords that actually are capturing the elements of this and that have emerged across disciplines and across sectors, and that's this new term of greening growth. And I think this is actually offering a way forward and a coalescing point for a number of the communities. And I'd like to argue that, greening growth is necessary and efficient. Certainly growth is necessary. Over the last 20 years, we've seen enormous economic growth, and we have seen a lot of poverty reduction in the developing world. The rapid rise in GDP per capita has enabled about 1 billion people to get out of poverty, and the poverty rates to decline really to a third of what they were in 1990. But we can't stop growth. That's not an option for developing countries. It needs to remain large, and the implication then is that we need a different kind of growth. So there's several elements to this. I already showed you the Los Plateau, but climate-smart landscapes can protect ecosystem services, clean water, clean air. Green policies can make the physical capital more resilient to destruction or depreciation. So if you can guard against flood and landslides by increasing permeable surfaces or building away from the new flood zones, etc., that can help. Environmental policies can improve productivity and labor supply too. And we know that, for example, field workers' productivity go down very significantly when air pollution is high. And so we know that environmental degradation can undercut productivity. In many parts of the world, green growth could actually clean up the existing burden of disease. And in this map, the darkest colors suggest 30 to 40% of current disease burden is related to environmental problems today. So we could reduce the disease burden of the world today and those expected going forward tomorrow with greener growth. Certainly innovation, spurring innovation is very important, and green growth can do that. We know green policies, we know regulations certainly do focus the mind on helping people figure out how either to make money out of new products or how to save money while reducing the pollutants that they have been asked to reduce. Actually, we also know that environmental degradation is costly, and this is a synthesis of country analyses done for the World Bank across 20 developing countries. And if you believe this number, it's saying the average, the red line of environmental degradation can be 8% of GDP. One of the things that's really driving this, though, is it's done by person, and so China is very much driving the 8%. I think if you, it would be more at about 2%, but regardless, environmental degradation is costing GDP. Many of the steps to kind of green the economy, though, will really involve trade-offs, either through substantial upfront costs or in lower returns in the short term, but in exchange for longer sustainable returns. And this is the case, for example, in farming, if you're going to go from something like this intensive farming to something that would be more sustainable but low-till, no-till agroforestry. So why isn't green growth really happening now? Well, it's challenging for many reasons. It encounters tricky political economy, I would argue. You really have to modify deeply entrenched behaviors, and there's not enough financing. So I think it goes without saying that green growth policies may not be politically popular. I think that's probably an understatement. So if we could remove subsidies, for example, for fossil fuels, which number hundreds of billions of dollars a year, we might be making a difference. If we look at Mexico, 1% of Mexico's GDP is on subsidies for the energy used in irrigation, and that's causing incredible groundwater withdrawals and depletion of their aquifers. In India, about 2% of GDP is spent on a fertilizer subsidy that's excessively weighted in favor of nitrogen, which is causing a lot of pollution problems. So this complex political economy means that feasibility has to be balanced against costs. And one study I saw said, well, you know, there's going to be a water gap in India, and you could fill that water gap with $6 billion or $40 billion. If you do it by land reform, it's $6 billion. It's cheap, but it's really politically difficult. If you do it by desalination, it's expensive. It's the $40 billion. But even if the reforms are passed, green growth must overcome the entrenched behaviors and aspirations of the emerging middle class, who by and large are hurtling towards an unsustainable level of model of living. So how do we convince individuals that large houses in the suburbs and individual car commutes is not a right or desirable standard of success? Does anyone want to guess where this is? Actually, Kevin might know. No, it's not here. It's in Shenyang in northeast China. Kind of looks like it could be right here, though, doesn't it? So this chart shows you the magnitude of the funding for just climate change mitigation and adaptation. Again, these are numbers we put together for the World Development Report. And so we estimated the mitigation, the pale blue bar, was going to cost, if you subtract out adaptation, about $175 billion a year. But that is after you make the investment and you get back from the investment those that pay for themselves. So the upfront financing is more like the second bar on the order of $500 billion. So does anybody know what overseas development assistance in total is worldwide? Not that much. So total overseas development assistance is $130 billion a year. So I'm just showing you, oh, that was not good. That may be the end. Can we come back? Yes. So that was just showing you, you know, we need somewhere between some mitigation and adaptation, 200 billion with 500 billion as the beginning, and that we're seeing development assistance is only 130 billion. So a whole lot more money needed. Now, public R&D and research, development and demonstration is not nearly enough. This is in the IEA countries, where the purple line is showing you the energy R&D as a percent of R&D, so that's coming in as about 4%, and the totals are coming in at about $16 billion a year. We were just talking about hundreds of billions of dollars. This is not nearly enough. I just attended a recent conference that the United Nations Foundation and Ceres did to talk about what total funding in energy RD&D would need to be to effect that precipitous change that I showed you of all the wedges. And they estimate that if you look at all public and private energy R&D, we could be up to 281 billion, the bottom arrow there. I'm not quite sure how they even get it up that high, but their answer is that by 2030, it has to be $1 trillion, and it has to be $1 trillion sustained in order to get us to that 2-degree non-roasted world. So you can't get that kind of money from public finance. You absolutely have to go to the business sector and the investment community. And in the room where they were presenting this report, there was allegedly $15 trillion represented in the investment community then and there. So if they can engage, there is some hope. I just wanted to end by talking about some positive signs of progress here at home. Actions that are going on now that I think are in the green growth mode, that are encouraging smart behavior and are encouraging environment, economy, and social progress. The first thing is in changing mindsets. You know, a battle cry among the water managers is stationarity is dead, and that is the water managers always would build, assuming the last century was a good surrogate for the future, and as I've tried to show you, the past is not prologue. I think that the sequence of droughts and floods that we have seen are actually making it, especially droughts, are making it clear that the old cycle, which starts at the bottom right, apathy, drought, awareness, concern, panic, rain, apathy, drought, awareness, concern, panic, rain, is being broken. And Right now, there are 47 states that have developed drought plans in place. I'm not sure why Louisiana, Alaska, and Wisconsin don't. But I think that is making apathy and mindsets a little, apathy harder to maintain and mindsets easier to change. There's activity at the federal level, too. Under an executive order, the president, Executive Order 13514, the president required every agency to think about adaptation, but now it's been required that they embed an adaptation plan inside a sustainability plan. So the idea that you're building climate change concerns into the broader milieu is happening. And there's lots and lots of local action. And in so many ways, I think that cities are really where the rubber hits the road. Citizens have to be protected by their city governments. And so in Boston here, you are leaders on green infrastructure, and you are requiring all large new developments to consider climate change, which I think is great. Cambridge is not too shabby either. It's developing a climate preparedness plan, which actually had an amazing set of stakeholder involvement and contributions to it. Chicago, a lot happening in green roofs and trees for heat management. Philadelphia, my hometown, ambitiously trying to convert a third of its impervious surfaces, so that's pavements, parking lots, and roads, to permeable surfaces in the next 15 years so that the water can pass through. King County, Washington, had a federal disaster every other year, so it's decided that it should raise, relocate, or demolish chronically flooded structures. New York City doing a whole lot. Just a couple of things here, including they're capturing their runoff, and they're also rebuilding their natural wetland buffers. But in concert with the public sector, I really do think there's incredible movement on the private sector. I already told you about the investment community getting excited and coming and talking about what the investment needs to be. But we know that countries are also leading the way, both the Fortune 100 and the Global 100. About 60% of them are setting energy goals or greenhouse gas targets. So 60%, so the glass is slightly more than half full. And in addition to the supply chain graphic I showed you about corporations, the complex energy water nexus is very much in the news. And corporations are definitely paying attention. Their continued business and profits depend on paying attention to the energy, water, climate nexus. And as I said, the development community is paying attention. I just chaired a meeting 2 weeks ago, and it turns out that every development bank is developing screening tools for projects to figure out whether they can persist as climate changes. And so I found this article, which just came out on April 7th, on the World Bank, pretty interesting, where they're saying, hey, 3/4 of the World Bank projects still don't evaluate climate risks. I wonder what the percentage would be for United States-backed projects don't evaluate climate risks. But I think this is interesting. This is a real turning of the tide. This is holding these guys accountable to evaluating whether what they're putting in place is likely to persist. And so in July, the World Bank is going to require all new projects funded in the poorest countries of the world, that's the IDA countries, the International Development Association, to be screened for their short-term and long-term climate risks. And so I think the development agencies are moving too. This is really a very big change. So I think there's progress, public, private, development agencies. So I do think moving towards this concept of green growth and the triple goals of economic, environmental, and social sustainability is really happening. It's happening across sectors. I do think sustainability is within our reach. I know we don't want to be the first generation to leave the next a truly irreversible problem and a roasted world. So I believe we can avoid that world and give the poorest our common future, as the Brundtland Report called for in 1983. So those are my reflections on thinking about the linkage of climate change, sustainable development, and moving towards green growth. And the challenge for us and for the students in this room is a sustainable development on our ever-changing climate. So with that, thank you very much for your attention, and I'll entertain questions.
So we have two microphones because we are recording this. So I'll just ask you to wait for a microphone. We have two microphones available. So, and I'll just moderate if that's okay, with you. Why don't you stand up here so that you're also on a mic? And so, questions in front. So I'm going to go here. Then Suchi, you're next. You guys are going to discover the limitations of my peripheral vision. Pretty quick.
Okay, I'm Richard Rosen from the Telus Institute. I was actually a reviewer on the Working Group 3 report on mitigation, particularly on the economics. So, other little quibbles aside, I think, I hate to say it, I think you're way off base on the economic prospects of financing a transition to deal with climate change. First of all, as far as I know, most of the reports, including the ones you cite, only look at certain aspects of the investment needed in the energy system, okay, because I don't know if you know the Jacobson paper from Stanford, but that alone says we need gross investment of $1 trillion a year just for the United States, just to go to renewables, okay? Forget efficiency and other things. Then they don't include mass transit, investing in mass transit. They don't include usually the numbers to invest in agriculture and organic agriculture and sustainable agriculture. So there's whole huge parts of the economy that, as far as I know, the models that have been used for those studies don't include at all. Okay. I use a rough back of the envelope calculation of $5 trillion a year in gross investment. I know you're chuckling, but that's the problem.
I would
that's
be
the
happy
problem.
with that.
But by the way, $5 trillion is still much less than the total gross investment in the world.
Absolutely.
It's still a lot less, but I think you're talking numbers like that to get where we need to go. So my feeling is we have to be much more realistic. We also have to go back and challenge the models, because I know from my work in Working Group 3 that the models are crappy on the economics. I mean, they're terrible, okay? They're all wrong, and they don't include most sectors. So, I mean, they don't even include investment in more efficient automobiles, for example. I mean, it's not included in any of these studies. So that's one thing, just magnitude. I think you're off by almost a factor of 10. In terms of the private sector, of course the private sector will have to be involved to some extent. But again, I'd like to, when you said early on, the public sector has to lead, and there's a very important reason, I think, for that when you consider finance. Because the world can't afford giving the private sector high rates of return on their part of the investment. Inequality has already been growing in the world for 30 years because of high rates of return in capital markets. So if you have rates of return on the investments we need to deal with climate change and sustainable development higher than the rate of productivity growth, labor productivity growth, which is only 1.5% real, you shift more of the returns to the rich and away from the poor. And that's unsustainable in its own sense within the financial sector. So unfortunately, I think we need a lot more money than you're talking about in many other sectors of the economy. And we need much lower rates of return than anyone is talking about in the reports. And I think that can only come from the government, in fact, because they have to be subsidized loans, basically. So your comments on that, please.
So, well, I'm not the economist, so I would defer to the economist. I mean, obviously, the cost could be much greater. What I was trying to do was triangulate on a number of costs produced by the World Bank, produced by the IPCC. So trying to triangulate what the development sector thinks, what the science sector thinks, and what the investment community thinks. And I think $1 trillion, we would be very lucky if we had investment in energy RD&D at $1 trillion. But to move a standing stock of 15 trillion, which I think is what the energy systems in the world are worth, and you look at investment for other sectors like 8% a year in pharmaceuticals or whatever, we're absolutely way under investing in energy RD&D. So what I don't know, and what you would know better than me, is, I mean, I don't think all of these things need to be additive. You get some 2-fers or 3-fers or 4-fers if you are promoting innovation that can also lead to improved health outcomes and, you know, improved efficiency in energy, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know if it really is all additive, but I would agree what we're spending now is at least 2 orders of magnitude wrong. I may be off by 1 order of magnitude on what we need. But the necessity of scaling up the money very quickly is certainly true, or the futures precluded. I mean, the longer you continue on the business as usual path, the harder and harder it is to come down. You're throwing away existing infrastructure if you're not building it right from the get-go. And, you know, I have to say, what has really struck me, so I gave this talk at the UN Foundation, and I've now been called by NASDAQ, by Morgan Stanley, not this talk, but NASDAQ, Morgan Stanley, CalPERS, TIAA, CREF, and all these groups are trying to think about what sustainable investing means for them. Should they divest of fossil fuels? Should they? And of course, I can't advise them on that. But I think the fact that the size of these entities is thinking about the size of this problem is genuinely new. And I think the capability of having impact is much increased if we have turned, you know, these huge financial giants to thinking in this direction. Whether it's enough, I don't comment on. But I think we have, you know, we have no choice but to try to be optimistic, because the roasted world is not a world that I think will recognize it all. And the continuing cost of disasters year after year. I mean, Munich Re is really quite distraught about their projections on what's going to happen with these weather-related disasters. So I hope I'm right and you're wrong. I suspect you're right and I'm wrong, but we're off by at least 2 orders of magnitude from where we are today. I agree with that.
Sushi.
I just had like a follow-up question to you. You did not include the cost of diseases. You know, you sort of mentioned that there's going to be a lot of disasters related with health and public health and things like that. But there is so much that we don't know. We haven't even costed it. You know, it could be malnourishment. It could be death because of starvation. There's going to be like migrations cost because of climate change.
Absolutely.
And there's also heat strokes and heat deaths, which we don't think is climate change at this point, but that's on the increase the world over. So I wanted you to comment on the cost.
Yeah, so I haven't looked at what the World Health Organization has produced recently, but they were saying about 5 years ago, 150,000 people a year are already dying from climate change. The warmer temperatures mainly increasing diarrheal diseases, not so much the spread of disease vectors with a warmer, wetter world, but much more the more mundane, you know, malnutrition, diarrheal diseases that are controllable. The one chart that I did show you from the United Nations Environment Program was showing that 30 to 40% of current disease burden is related to environmental effects, which is also clean water, lack of sanitation, and all that. So no, I agree completely. Heat stress will cost a fortune. I haven't seen good estimates of that. There's great debate, as probably others in the room know better than I, about whether the actual spread in disease vectors like malaria mosquitoes should be considered. I mean, the IPCC historically had looked at where the range for them living is, which is very different than whether our institutional systems are prepared to detect, catch, and deal with those diseases. So something between the two is more appropriate. But the extreme heat, you know, I was showing you this 5 sigma just with where we are in this decade. The World Bank's Turn Down the Heat 2 report, which looked at sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia, showed in some countries you would be actually reaching physiological limits for livestock to be outside unless you could cool them. I mean, so these 5 sigma heat events going forward in the future for humans and for livestock, if we head to the 4-degree world, will be astronomical. And so, you know, all of that is leading them to the we can't go there answer.
Over on the left and then back over here.
So this administration is trying to move forward on climate change through executive order and other, you know, steps like that because they realize they don't have a partner in Congress. how far can we get with whatever leadership there is in the private sector, cities, states, without Congress taking action? And if we do need Congress to take action, what's it going to take to get them to act?
Wish I knew. You know, we were talking earlier today about some of the legislation that one was able to get through Congress, say the Clean Air Act revisions in 1990, because we knew we were on an unsustainable path with sulfur and nitrogen emissions, and that which cannot go on forever must someday change. And, you know, people were willing to say we have to bend that curve and figure out the end point later. It almost feels we're in the opposite situation now, where, you know, until every fact is in place, we can't act at all. I think what I don't know, and I'd be really anxious to see, is what the composite of things that the president is putting in place add up to in terms of a mountain of CO2. And so certainly the new source performance standards, what's going to happen with existing stationary sources, what's happening with vehicles, the methane effort, the HFC effort with China, all of that is actually pretty substantial. I mean, you're changing the intensity of carbon in, you know, in the fossil fuel industry. I mean, it could be that gas with carbon capture sequestration will ultimately be kind of the future standard, which would be quite substantial. So I think, though, I mean, you know, again, the history of looking at these things is really difficult. When policies have succeeded, you've usually had things pushing in the same direction from multiple places, and so having you know, some carrots and sticks, and not having a cap and trade program is a terrible loss. I mean, I've heard some people say we can't do that anymore. That's just become toxic term, cap and trade. So if you need a financial signal, which I think you do, maybe it would come as part of comprehensive tax reform someday, where somewhere in whatever they're going to do is buried something that will lead to taxing pollution bads and rewarding action goods. I do think that the cities are getting more and more desperate to make progress, because they are seeing that, much like the developing countries, they're losing ground as these climate shocks are coming more and more often. And so I think they are demanding at least more information from the federal government. But I guess, you know, the answer to your question is, without legislative and executive branch working together, and with the private sector having more signals than they have today, I think it's going to be hard to effect the 1 trillion, the 5 trillion, the whatever the right number is. And given that the whole world is coming together in 2015 to try to come up with the next phase of the Framework Convention on Climate Change, my personal belief is, if the U.S. doesn't come with a hill of CO2 or mountain of CO2, the rest of the world isn't going to think we're serious. And then I don't think we'll have a serious agreement, which was going to enter by 2020. And then, as one of the students in the room said to me, "You've been working on this for 22 years, as long as I've been alive, and you know, you haven't made progress on it." And that's a really upsetting statement, but true. So I really think 2015 is a kind of make it or break it for the U.S. to show something in order for it to be a partner again with the rest of the world. And I don't think we'll have comprehensive tax policy by then. An executive order is better than nothing, and the courts are sort of supporting this, but it's not all we need, and certainly not all we should hope for the next generation.
Kira, I think you were next.
Hi, I'm Rick Wetzler. 36 years ago, we were in Fred Smith's marine ecology course in Woods Hole together. It's wonderful to see you've been up to a few things since. I have a perhaps naive question. It seems to me at the treaty PrepCom meetings, there's a great deal of consciousness about the burden that the U.S. and the G7 have created compared to the G77. But in the streets, it seems like we're getting off scot-free. What about the role of opprobrium, of pure hatred for our gas-guzzling behaviors at the local level And what is that as a forcing function? Do you see that as something that's actually going to loop back and perhaps influence some of the multinational corporations you've been talking about that followed up your UN Foundation efforts? Is this something we're going to see, or am I naive in to assume that, in fact, we're not getting a carte blanche with men in the street in Bangladesh with each flood that comes on? It seems like the hatred towards the U.S. for all of the climate change that we're bringing on should be quite a significant factor by now, not just at the higher echelon committee levels, the IPCC and others.
Well, so first of all, the course I met you on is the one that convinced me I wanted to live in Woods Hole the rest of my life. So I got derailed after that. If you watch any of the videos from the climate treaty, it's just completely heart-wrenching to watch the small island states, really literally weeping in most cases about what we have done and are doing to their livelihoods. And there have been many situations in the climate negotiations where the U.S. has been told to shut up and sit down if they're not going to move forward. But, I don't know, maybe this is very cynical, but most of those nations are not the wealth power of the world. And, there's a lot of anger towards the rich countries for creating the problem, and a lot of discussion about whether there should be emissions per person, not emissions per dollar GDP, et cetera. But what kind of sanctions or sticks does the developing world have against the wealthy parts of the world to act out their anger?
If you go to Phuket, Thailand, they basically raised a tantalum mine, or if you go to Bhopal, India, the retribution for Union Carbide years ago.
Union Carbide, yeah.
I would imagine there would be some pretty serious, almost terrorist scale reprisals in time, but I'm not sure. Perhaps I'm just...
I hadn't thought about that. I was thinking of national security from a different angle than from that. An interesting development that some of the students are talking about with me over lunch is in the U.S., the divestment campaign, where colleges are being asked to look at their investment portfolios and if they're investing in damaging things, fossil fuels, chemicals, whatever. Is that what their hard-earned resources should be used on? I think that's an interesting development in the U.S. But yes, the anger of a lot of the developing countries towards the U.S. is real, but they also need the U.S., the biggest contributor to the World Bank, which is giving them development money. And so it's very hard for them to hold our feet to the fire when they're also accepting finance.
Sure.
Thank you. I had a question about, you talked a lot about the World Bank and the way they're moving forward with development plans, and that they are, which is good, looking more at social sustainability, environmental sustainability, and sort of well-being in general. But there are a lot of organizations and institutions that have that at their core, have environmental well-being or social well-being at their core, but that don't have the sort of power behind them that the World Bank has, but that I know, and I think you have some experience with the Wildlife Conservation Society and others, that are going, that have at their core these environmental well-being ideas, but are shifting more to sort of livelihoods in some of their projects and development concerns. And I was wondering if there are trends in sort of maybe cooperation and coordination amongst the organizations that focus on the different aspects of sustainability, or if they're pretty much operating independently and trying to take on what aspects of the others that they can.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question, Kara. I've only been on the Wildlife Conservation Board for a few years, but in fact, when I got there, they had not really done any kind of serious analysis of what climate change might do to all of the area. I mean, they're about conservation, all the areas they were going to protect. And there have been a number of studies that have shown that if you overlay maps of where ecosystems are going to shift and where protected areas are, all this money that you're investing in protecting things to keep them like they are today is not going to be efficient or effective. So I think a number of the conservation organizations have been slow to come to thinking about climate change, and especially to think about, and what can we do about it? I mean, how do you adapt a park or a protected area? I do see some positive signs. I think Again, thinking about where the big money is, the foundations who fund some of these NGO groups that are focused on conservation are trying to at least, I don't know if they're focusing on climate change, but they're trying to move upstream to looking at root causes as opposed to pollution or symptoms or outcomes. And so the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, if you look at the Global Environment Facility, their newest documentation is we're losing the environment war, even though we spent a huge amount of money. Some of it is due to social reasons, economic reasons, climate reasons, whatever. And so they're trying to move upstream to the idea of tackling unsustainable consumption and production, beef, soy. You can go through the series Unsustainable Fisheries. And green growth is sort of like a synonym to some of the terms that they're using now. So I think that is positive, but that brings in places where those entities aren't particularly familiar. So now they will have to think about business, the investment community, the cattle industry, and so it makes it much messier. But I think it's a good sign because it's trying to go literally, to the root cause of overconsumption and overproduction. So in that sense, I think some of the foundations are moving in that direction. Global Environment Facility, which is a consortium of about 12 development entities, and actually includes 2 NGOs now, WWF and CI, Conservation International Wildlife. So I think that's good news. But they have not been coordinating. I think, though, the power of money could make them coordinate. The convening power of some of these huge foundations or development entities should not be overlooked in trying to get progress quickly.
Over here, Jake, and then Kevin, and then Adil.
Hi, Jake.
Small things like the United States discussions with China on the
HFCs.
on the industrial gases all the way to all the other international bodies. Where do you see other places that you think might be making could make a contribution in the context of the frustrations with the FCCC?
Yeah, there are a lot of people who think that it has outlived its usefulness, I guess. There are some folks who are looking at what pieces of the climate problem we could divest to the Montreal Protocol, to POPs, to other conventions conceivably to get some impact. And maybe some of that is possible. I said in the beginning that the U.S. and China are now 43% of the world's emissions. You don't really need most of the countries in Africa to agree to something, at least, for the foreseeable future, to bend that curve by, another 2 decades from now. So I think there might, I think maybe, so there might be something in using the other treaties to go after some of this. But I think there might be a role for many more of these bilaterals or trilaterals or a small number of countries to come to some kind of agreement. But nothing yet surfacing. Really, so Christiana Figueros, who's the executive secretary of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, goes, listen, by December of this year, the end of 2014, I kind of need to know what we're going to be negotiating in 2015. And there's not a lot on the table. Of course, there is a meeting in Peru, in Lima, in November. But I don't see much, emerging from the U.S. So I'm not sure what form those, few country agreements could take. But since you really only need, depending on how you count it, between 5 and 20 countries, you don't really need the whole process.
Kevin?
Hi, first of all, thanks so much for coming. A great talk, and cheers to the Pardee Center for hosting this distinguished lecture. My name is Kevin Gallagher from the Pardee School of Global Studies. We've been talking a lot about about the World Bank. I have a question related to the World Trade Organization. So the U.S. Congress has been saying to emerging market emitters that we're not going to act unless you act in a substantive way, but we're not going to add any more financing to it. So China, the other component of the 43% of the emissions, went out and built and did a lot of technological leapfrogging and built a world-class solar PV industry. And the United States is now taking them to the World Trade Organization and might perhaps roll back that entire effort. Do you think acting differently might be relaxing some of these global economic governance restrictions to put our efforts towards working together with the Chinese on green growth?
Well, that's a really tough question. You probably know a better answer to it than I do. And I don't know a lot about the WTO, but I think, you know, the scale of producing the technological solutions that we need is far beyond what any country or two can do. And in the carbon capture sequestration wedge that I showed you, that giant blue one, I mean, most people think you need 20 pretty large size working units to prove it in different geologies and different parts of the world. And so how is that going to happen if we're not collaborating with other countries? I mean, that really needs to happen. So I don't want to prognosticate here, but I think just about everything should be on the table. You know, thinking about what carrots and sticks exist in the composite array of diplomatic circles. I was saying earlier today that, you know, when the U.S. walked from the Kyoto Protocol on Valentine's Day of 2001, the rest of the world was really thinking hard about sanctions for us, you know, that they were so mad. And, you know, I often wonder what would have happened if that had continued, if September 11th hadn't happened and the world had to, you know, if there, you know, what it would be that they would have brought to bear on the U.S. So, yeah, we need really massive renewable energy technology deployment and really fast. And you probably know the scale of that better than I do. So I would hope that our diplomatic circles will use any tool in the toolkit they can find.
Thanks. Thank you for a wonderful talk, and thank you for a very informative talk. My name is Adil Najam. I served as a lead author on IPCC 2 and then a CLA on 3 and 4. So all of this, the one thing that surprised me the most was your repeated mention that growth is necessary. I counted 6 times. And so I wondered if you can say a bit more about that. You know, I mean, I drive a Prius and I think trees on rooftops are cute. But it's really like, you know, stopping a tsunami with a door stopper, the scale that you have put forth. If half those numbers are true, and I think all of them are true, then can we really continue on the fetish of growth? I can understand Bangladesh needing to grow. But are we in this room not really fooling ourselves that, you know, we can continue on this?
No, I didn't mean we. I meant the developing world needs to continue. I mean, the chart that I showed that on was what had happened in the last several decades in terms of poverty alleviation and, you know, annual salaries, if you will, in the developing countries, which are still quite pathetic. And so I meant, you know, there has to be a growth in standard of living, and in the countries of the world where they're at a half a ton of carbon and we're at 20, there has to be real growth in production and consumption of something. It can be done in a very green way, but it is still going to mean that they're going to grow their energy use. The billion people who don't have energy are going to need to grow that. So, I mean, there's got to be growth in the developing world, which I think the developed world has to more than compensate for. One of the analyses we did early in the Clinton administration, which I don't think I've seen since because of how grim it was looking at per capita emissions if you wanted to reach a 2-degree target in the rich countries of the world, and you looked at how fast you thought you could damp their emissions, and then what was left for the rest of the world. And it's pretty striking. I mean, some of those, you know, if you want to allow people to get to 1/10 of the emissions we're at now, we're going to blow way past 2 degrees. So the inexorability of the numbers is pretty daunting. But I mean, in the poorest countries of the world, there absolutely has to be growth to lift them out of poverty, growth in economics, in education, in energy. And I didn't mean we need to grow anymore.
Is there one more in the back?
I was in Africa in Malawi and Zambia in November, and on looking at improved cook stoves. And these are, as the UN likes to say, bottom of the pyramid people. Okay, they live on $1 a day basically, and they spend a huge amount of their income on charcoal, and it takes 10 tons of wood to make 1 ton of charcoal. I mean, it's so inefficient. They are trapped in poverty, and you're in these villages, and everything I'm standing there talking to this lady, and she's telling me how much less wood she uses now that she has a cook stove, and then driving back into Lilongwe, back into the town, we passed 20 villages where, of course, they're not using improved cook stoves. And the thing that I kept reminding myself, I mean, it's very labor intensive, as I'm sure you know, to extension workers, changing a deep cultural practice, all the rest of it. It's terrible for the health of maternal and child health, deforestation, degradation, all of this stuff. And yet, even if we could, and the adoption rate of all these cook stove projects, which they maybe were talking about at that series and UN Foundation meeting, is very low. But these are not the people who are, as you just said, I mean, yes, they're burning up their forests and they're suffering from the consequences of indoor air pollution, but their carbon emissions are nothing compared to what I'm going to generate driving home. And
That's right.
I don't have a Prius. I wish I did. So there seems to me, there's something when you talk about the development and the World Bank and all of this, very, the World Bank does a lot of, good things and is funding some of this stuff and linking it to health, to the dailies and all of that stuff. But meantime, aviation is getting off scot-free. Meantime, China is opening a new coal plant every day. So, my hat is really off to you that you're still at this, because as I stood there, I just thought it was very hard to feel hopeful. And I guess my question for you, and I hate when people say, I have a question and they make a statement, but I get my question for you is, do you go out into the field, and when you do, and you're in the developing world, where we're doing a lot of work, do you find yourself thinking, it's not really about this?
Well, so yes, but where you started, your example with the cook stoves, you're right. They're not the CO2 problem. They're a significant part of the black carbon problem, and they're killing themselves. And so that, if you're going after that 0.5 degree in the near term, that we may be able to take a gouge out of to give ecosystems and humans longer to adapt, we should absolutely give them better health and, and reduce the time they're spending in the field. The whole reason, I think the whole cook stove issue is very, very interesting. There have been some reviews of all of the programs that all of the entities have tried to do, and why they're so unsuccessful is interesting. So Kirk Smith from Berkeley is now putting little chips in them, and he often finds that like the minute you leave the village, they get put up like a vase on the shelf, and then they're not used. He can actually tell when they're being used. So that's a whole different thing. So I think we're not trying to say they have to control their emissions, although the deforestation is bad, the health issues are bad, the black carbon is bad. There's I think a triple win there for them for lifestyle if you can do it. I mean, China is a very interesting case, and again, Kevin knows more about this than I do, but you know, their 5-year plan, if the one that they're engaged in now, would reduce more CO2 emissions than Kyoto Protocol if it had been implemented with everybody participating. Of course, they're growing at a prodigious rate, but they're producing all these renewables. So there's, you know, it's this very difficult situation where they're actually trying to do a lot of good stuff even while growing, and whether they're willing to take a target in the next negotiation will be pretty interesting, or at least an intensity target or a future total cap. Aviation, yes. I don't know why we can't do something with aviation, but I mean, it's, you know, the problem is it's obviously a patchwork of stuff. You can't say we can do nothing, because you can get things that add up to an amount of radiative forcing that's a very significant reduction. And the slower, you know, the lower you can keep the rate of growth of emissions, as we were saying before, the less supply you need to build to produce it if you're coming in with renewables. And you know, if you can keep demand down, the less supply you need to fill it with the new technologies. And the lower you keep the rates of growth, you know, the more capable you'll be of avoiding the 4-degree world. So I think, I mean, I think in the case of the developing countries, it is thinking about sustainable development. It's helping all 3 of those pillars of sustainability, the economic, the social, and the environmental simultaneously. And there's lots we can do that achieve all 3 of those. And, you know, I mean, I would bet you the World Bank is not going to do another big coal project unless it is the only way to electrify somewhere where they have no other options. They have certainly been beaten up quite a bit on big coal projects. So I don't mean to say, you know, they're going to make the world change, but I think the combination of all these forces trying to move in a direction that's recognizing a similar problem puts us in a better place today than we've been for the last 20 years. I mean, there's more business, more of the financial industry, more of the development industry. The science could not be a louder drumbeat. So one has to hope at some point the stars will align and we'll hit this alleged tipping point of actually making progress.
Great. Please join me in thanking Rosina again. And